on Manx Radio, another radio replay, celebrating 60 years of the many varied programmes produced by the Nation Station. This week, a chance to hear again an episode of the Tell Me Project, bringing school children together in conversation with some of their older relatives to reminisce and reflect on days gone by. Maybe you recognise some of the contributors. Or maybe you are one of the young interviewers, now grown up with your own family, building memories of your own. Here's our Mark Tiley to introduce today's episode.
Hello and welcome to the first of two programmes showcasing the work of the Tell Me Project for 2009. For the second year, school children from across the Isle of Man have been tasked with interviewing a person or persons they know aged 60 or over. This intergenerational education initiative was designed to motivate older people to record their memories by recounting them to children and to enhance understanding between generations. The children were given advice on interview technique and trained to operate mobile recording equipment on their own. In our first interview, Danielle Mather from St Ninians talks to her grandmother Anne Mather, and she started by asking what it was like growing up during the Second World War.
When I was living on the Isle of Man, I was brought up on the island, there wasn't a great deal of difference. I suppose the food was different, but I can't say we were greatly deprived. It was almost exciting to think of what was going on. I think the biggest difference was I simply didn't know my father until he came home when I was 6, and that created problems because I didn't know who this man was. And I think that's probably true of quite a few people who lived on the Isle of Man.
Was the siren scary?
I can't really say I remember it greatly on the island. It must have gone off. But I did spend quite a bit of time in London, in and around London, because we had family over there. And that was very different because it seemed more of an urgency to hear it in. And it was always wonderful to hear the wavery tones of the all clear, which came at the end of the air raid.
Did any family fight in the war?
Well, yes, my father, Danny McGrath, who's your great-grandfather, he was in REME, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers. He was in from early days of the war, so he was able to get out that bit earlier because he was one of the earliest volunteers to fight in the war. So yes, he was injured, I remember, twice. I remember hearing about my daddy being injured when he was in Belgium, but before then when he was in Egypt, because he was part of the 8th Army, who were generally known as the Desert Rats, who were fighting against Rommel in the earlier years, I think about 1942. And then when he was injured then he came back to Britain, but not to the Isle of Man, and then he joined in the Normandy landings and was also injured quite seriously when he was in Belgium.
Did life change after the war?
Yes, as I said, really, the main difference for me was that suddenly I had this man around the place, and my father, and I lived a very quiet and sheltered life, living with just my mother, and then with my grandparents, and then suddenly there was this man who came back and was quite a whirlwind in his personality. So yes, it was quite different. It took a bit of adjusting too.
What was the worst part of the war?
Well, I suppose it was growing up without knowing my father, so that when he did come back, he was an intruder. And I think if you read a bit about World War II, a lot of people felt that too. Who was this man who suddenly came in and started telling you what to do because you'd never had this before? Also, I suppose, because as I said, we went away a lot. It was very different when we were across, and we actually went before my father went for the D-Day landings in 1944. My mother and I went away and we lived on a farm, McDonald's farm, interestingly enough, somewhere in Surrey, and my father used to come and see us quite often, so we had some trying to build a relationship up then.
Were high streets and shops busy like today during the war?
Because of rationing, you tended to go to the shops. You were registered, I think, with certain shops for food like sugar, butter, meat. My great aunt, my grandfather's sister, had a shop, and we used to go up there, and I used to help her weigh out, put the biscuits in the bags, weighed out a pound of biscuits, because they weren't packaged in those days. You had to weigh them out. And I also used to weigh the sugar out into the pound sugar bags, which were dark blue. I suppose we might have been we were a lot luckier over here as far as rationing was concerned, because I can't remember ever being greatly starved. We used to eat an awful lot of rabbit, because obviously there were rabbits for the killing in the hills. We ate an awful lot of fish, so I think we probably had quite a healthy diet over here. Like your granddad, I was aware of bananas coming in and being disappointed in them. But I also remember being told by my mother, you wait till the war ends and then we'll have chicken, not rabbit. And the first chicken we got, I actually said, oh no, I'd really rather rabbit, the flavour of rabbit. So it was all a bit different, but I can't say there was a big difference. Noticed more of a difference when we went to England, I think.
What were schools like in the war?
I didn't go to school in the war, although I should have gone, I suppose, in 1944-45. I didn't actually go because we were spending so much time across. My great-grandparents were in Kent, and we had to go and see them quite a bit. They were very elderly, and I actually was 6 before I started school over here. So I didn't really get the feeling of being educated during the war years, because I wasn't really. I picked up when I went to school a bit later.
What were your thoughts about rations, and how many were given out monthly?
I can't quite remember, but I know they were very strictly adhered to. And you know, you couldn't sort of get away with anything over the top, or certainly that's as I understood it, because I used to go shopping for my grandmother on a Saturday sometimes with the ration book. I particularly remember sweets being rationed, which I did think was grossly unfair, but I don't suppose that did our teeth any harm at all, having only be able to have so many sweets. And I do remember quite clearly when rationing ended as far as sweets were concerned. I can't say that I ever felt deprived of anything in the food line. In the Isle of Man, we were lucky because at a certain part of the year, of course, there was a strawberry harvest, particularly down at Rushen Abbey. They used, before the war, they had made a thing about strawberries and cream teas. And we always had jam on our table, and it was strawberry jam. And people who came from across couldn't believe this. But there was one little, perhaps amusing little anecdote about that. At the end of the war, when you could get more, rationing was off, when you could get more jam, I was told not to worry about only putting jam on one half of the bread in a sandwich. I could put it all over the sandwich because now the rationing was off. And I can remember thinking, what on earth would anyone want to do that for? It's perfectly adequate with just on one side. So I wasn't really greatly affected by rationing, I don't think.
How long did it take to get back to normal after the war?
Well, I think it was in the 50s, really. Certainly I can remember being at St Thomas's School in Douglas and going to a little sweet shop nearby with my sweetie rations. So I would say it was certainly late 40s, I suppose. I think it went on till about 1953 in some respects. But as we were probably lucky, really, living on the Isle of Man.
What is your most memorable time during the war?
Strangely, it's nothing to do with the Isle of Man. It's when we were visiting family in London and in Kent. I have a vague memory. I can remember a sound. I can remember a sound suddenly stopping. Nobody knew what it was. Everyone was looking to see what it was. I can remember being pushed behind a wall and a big bang and a lot of dust in the air. My mother told me years afterwards, what I actually was remembering was we were not too far away from the first doodlebug which landed I think we must have been in Kent, although we could have been in the south of London at the time, and the Germans were sending them over by rocket over the Channel, and apparently we were aware of the very first one, because then it was realised and publicised that when you hear a buzz and it stops, that's when you're in danger. You're fine while the buzz is on. It was like an angry hornet sound. But once it stops, you had to take shelter quickly. So that's my main memory, I think, of the war.
Anne Mather talking to her granddaughter, Danielle Mather, from St Ninian's High School. Jack Gibney, also of St Ninian's High School, talked with Brigadier Norman Butler and started by asking him where he grew up.
I grew up in London, and I was there during the war, from the Second World War.
How did you handle the Blitz?
Funnily enough, for an 11-year-old, which is what I was, it was less frightening than you'd think. It was sort of more exciting than frightening. It was, of course, dangerous. You did see people killed, or see people who had been killed, I think, put it that way. But basically you went to bed at night in the shelter in the garden. Not everyone had a shelter, but we did. And you heard all this noise, and then after a time you slept in spite of the noise. You'd get up the next day and you'd find some of the wreckage. You'd find a house not too far from you had been destroyed. You might even find a friend of yours had been injured or killed.
Were you evacuated during the bombing campaign?
I was evacuated, but the way it worked is I was evacuated before the bombing, and we got fed up after 9 months of phony war and came back. And I was actually in London from October 1940 through the Blitz. I then went again away to Wales and came back finally to London in 1942.
Did you have any members of your family in the military?
Yes, my father was in the Air Force. Most of the adult members of the extended family were in the military. My father was in the Air Force. My uncle was a regular sailor who did serve at Dunkirk, and I was there when he came back from Dunkirk, which was quite an experience because his hair had gone from a dark grey to white.
What year did you join the armed forces?
I joined in 1947, so it was national service when I joined. I then decided to stay in, and I did 37 years.
What were the main conflicts you were involved with?
Basically, if you say the Cold War, which wasn't a conflict, but it was always going on, I suppose I spent 10 or 15 years involved in various aspects of that. But I was involved in a number of lesser wars. The Radfan campaign in the north of Aden, as it was then. The whole thing is now Yemen. The Aden campaign, which is another campaign, which is actually in Aden fighting terrorism. A minor campaign in Ghana when it got its independence. There was a little revolution which we put down. But by and large, I had, compared with what they're going through now, quite a quiet 37 years in the military. Not a lot of shots. I was wounded a couple of times, but not a lot of shots were fired at me.
Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, I do. I was in a quite an important position at that stage, important in terms of what I was doing. I was only a major, but I was in charge of the contingency planning for the land forces Central Europe. That's all the NATO land forces in Europe. And basically my job was to keep those plans up to date and help with the training exercises in which they were trained. And the contingency plans were basically there to give an automatic response to various situations. It was quite frightening. I'd only been about 10 months in the job when the Cuban Missile Crisis, a crisis of enormous possibilities, threat, when you look back on it. The Russians were able to damage America terribly. The Americans could have destroyed Russia, and that could have actually happened. It was on the knife edge. So there was I sitting with my contingency plans, and the very things listed in the contingencies were all happening, or some of them were happening. International tension, and the degrees of alert were going up like nobody's business. It only lasted about 3 or 4 days altogether from the first discovery by the Americans of a missile launching pad in Cuba, which naturally they couldn't possibly allow. to the fact there were Russian ships steaming with more missiles on their way. There was a face-off, and the Russians blinked. Mr. Khrushchev blinked first, gave way, turned the ships around, and the world was saved. But it would have been a catastrophe of enormous consequences. And I was sitting there worrying like hell about what we were going to do. I was more worried about things like the Russians coming over. Obviously, if the missile had been fired, the Russians would have attacked in Europe. And that was my particular area of responsibility.
Brigadier Norman Butler talking to Jack Gibney of St Ninian's High School about life during the Cold War.
You're listening to a Manx Radio replay of The Tell Me Project, the first episode in a series that was broadcast and produced in 2009.
In this first of two programmes, we're focusing on memories of the Second World War. As well as taking part in the D-Day landings, Hector Duff also served in North Africa. Ailish Swift from St Ninian's wanted to know how old he was when he signed up.
I was 19. I registered with the first batch of conscripts. They were 19 years of age and registered in Peel, and I was 19 then.
Who did you leave behind when you left? So, like your family?
Well, I'm my mother, my sister, my brother, but I was married, and I left my wife, who, when I left in the August of 1940, my wife was pregnant, so I left her pregnant when I went in 1940, and my daughter was born in the December 1940, and I didn't see her. The first time I saw her was in January 1944. So she was four years old when I first seen her.
What was Africa like? Is that where you went first, yes?
Yes, I first went to Africa, and it was, hot and very featureless, and it was an ideal place to fight, if you could call it an ideal place, because there was no civilians about, of course, and but there was no cover where you could hide. You had to dig yourself in, although I was in the position. I fought all through the war, either in a tank or an armoured car, so I didn't have to do any slit trench digging, but we used to have to sometimes dig the tank in or dig it out, really. We got stuck in the tank, in the soft sand. It was a featureless sort of a place, but there were what we called waddies and escarpments and that sort of thing, like little valleys where you could get into a position of sort of conceal yourself a little bit. We were always fighting going to the east, and of course we were fighting going into the sun, which was an advantage to the Germans. But yes, it wasn't the best of places to fight. There was no sanitation, no water and all that sort of thing. That was very short supply.
What was it like actually being in a battle?
I can't really describe it to you. It's horrendous, really. It's the very first. They always say a soldier's first battle is his best because he doesn't know what to expect. And on my first battle, I was driving a tank when I went into battle first, and we went sailing on. We met a few infantry and that sort of thing, which we sort of quickly disposed of. But we quickly ran into the German tanks and anti-tank guns, and we soon realised that things weren't going to be pleasant. And within minutes, the tanks were hit and knocked on fire and that sort of thing. And a burning tank is a horrible thing, really. It's like a dragon with flames spurting out from it, and if the men are injured when they're in it, they can't get out and all that sort of thing. It's not very pleasant. It's I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, and anybody that says they're not frightened going into action, I don't think they're telling the truth. I went into action. I was all through the desert fighting, and then later in Italy and D-Day and that sort of thing, and I could never say that I went in without any fear. Everybody's got fear, even ladies or everybody, fears of heights or whatever. And when you go into action, you're the same. But it depends how much control you can exercise over that fear at the time. And that's not helped by... And if you go into, say, when we went into action, if we seen one of our tanks on our flank, right or left side, and that sort of thing going up in flames or getting knocked out, we would think, oh, that's Jim or Jack has gone, who's going to be next? So that exercise gave you a little bit more fear, and you had to be more sort of determined to try to exercise control over it in situations like that.
Did you get training for the tanks, or were you just shoved into them?
Oh, no, I was trained before I went out from England. I was trained, and I started my training in a tank, and within 10 weeks I was in Egypt. But I could drive before I went into not tanks, of course. I could drive before I went into the army, and we did all the training. In a tank, you have to be capable of being a driver or an operator or a gunner. You're trained to do all three because you sort of maybe transferred from one tank to another. If one tank is knocked out, they may say, I want a couple of drivers or 2 gunners or something like that. So you had to be sort of able to do all things. And I eventually got to be that I was sometimes as a corporal, even I was in charge and command of a tank and that sort of thing. And which put a lot of orders and pressure on you when you thought, I'm going to say to do this, and 3 or 4 men sitting alongside of me, and I was taking their lives putting their lives at risk. But you got used to it, and they all accepted it. We're all a happy little band I wasn't, can't say that I was very long with a particular crew because I was in a lot of tanks that were knocked out and that sort of thing. But we all got to be a little family, and we all used to help each other, and even the officers, we called them by their Christian names and that sort of thing, unless they were very senior.
You were in the Desert Rats. Yes. Why do you have that nickname?
Well, every division has a sign. You see, you couldn't have divisions wandering about without being noted. And when you go into battle, every division has what they call a centre line, or we used to call it then Charlie Love CL centre line. Now, so that that's to prevent one division sort of firing on another, which could be a friendly one. So you all had the divisional signs. The Desert Rats, we were on the desert longer than any other regiment, and there was a little reptile on there called a jabor, which was a long rat with long hind legs and a tail which had a sort of a spade on the end of it, which you used to use to dig in the sand and that sort of thing. And they got quite tame if you were stationed. And before the 1941 battle on the desert, we were static for a long, long time. And these little jabors and the gazelles and that sort of thing used to come round. So we chose, I don't know who, we chose to have the jabor as our divisional sign. And I've got it here on my lapel now still.
The D-Day landings you were also in, what were they like?
Well, I was sort of fortunate. I didn't go in till afternoon on the morning, but a lot of our lads went in early in the morning. Not so much our tanks, you see. Tanks could land, and we did have DD tanks called swimming tanks that could land, but I didn't have any of them. I was in the orthodox Cromwell tanks. And our division, the 7th Armoured Division, again, were going to be the first tanks to land that were operational tanks to fight. So I landed in the afternoon. In the morning, it was must have been horrendous because it was bad enough when I landed in the afternoon, and I landed in an armoured car, not a tank, with a lot of the regimental adjutants of the other regiments. We landed because our division, the 7th Armour, were going to land in the morning after D-Day, D-Day +1. So we had to go to find out a place where they could go. When we landed, you see, our tanks were waterproofed, and you could fight with them being waterproof, but not very well. It prevented the turret from traversing and that sort of thing, and the engine overheated and that, so we had to get rid of that. So we had to find places for there's 3 armoured regiments in the division. We had to find places for them. So their adjutants were with me. Was a group of about 10 or 12 armoured cars, and we landed. And it was the only thing we could say, we were being shelled. I wouldn't say they were firing at a particular individual car. They were firing at an area. They knew where we were landing, and we were firing. So our job was to get off the beach as quickly as we could. And there was men there, and the beach control officer they were all Marines, and they got you off the beach quickly too. So we got off and found out where we could de-waterproof and get ready for fighting the next day.
That was Hector Duff, talking to Ailish Swift of St Ninians. This is Tell Me, reflecting the work of the Tell Me project for 2009. Next week on the programme, we'll hear about growing up in Scotland, in Renfrewshire to be exact. We'll also hear from Major Charles Wilson, a career soldier who tells Adam Creemore what made him decide to join the army. He'll also tell Adam about life during the Cold War. June Gaughan talks to Ellie Stevenson and Naomi Griffiths about guiding and the Brownies and some of the changes that have taken place over the last few years. And Graziella Pedro and Jordan Lamb from Murray's Road School are fascinated by what Mrs. Janet Norris has to tell them about growing up in years gone by. All of that and more on next week's Tell Me programme at the same time here on Manx Radio. Thanks for listening. I'm Mark Tiley. I look forward to your company then.
Many thanks to Mark, Tiley and all of the wonderful contributors, both young and young at heart. Tune in the same time next week for another Manx Radio replay, celebrating 60 years of programmes and broadcasts from your nation station. For now, thanks for listening.